you for it. Yes. Thank you.
All right. So this is just going to be loading itself up onto YouTube now, and it's going to redirect us. And so give me just a wee second. The joys of technology. And here we go. I'm just checking, and we are live on the website as well. Hello to everyone who is tuning in. I'm so excited to see an audience from Canada and Cyprus and further afield, and here in the room with us to have a host, our host Mustafa, who's tuning in from New York, and of course our author, Fida Jiryis, who is in Ramallah. Before I hand over to our host to tell you more and to take you on a journey through this book, Stranger in My Own Land, which is truly astonishing, and I would entreat you all to buy a copy afterwards if you haven't already. Allow me to introduce our real host for the night, who is an award-winning and critically acclaimed author himself. Mustafa Bayoumi is the author of How Did It Feel to Be a Problem, Being Young and Arab in America, which won the American Book Award and the Arab American Book Award for Nonfiction. Mustafa is also a columnist for The Guardian, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, Daily Beast, The Nation, CNN.com, and the London Review of Books, to name but a few places. And so we are thrilled that Hearst made it possible for us to have him with us tonight. And so I'm going to switch my view now to bring them both on screen. Hello, hello. There we go. And now I am going to disappear and hand over to you, Mustafa. Take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mayri. And I just want to thank everybody for coming today and for joining us in this really fantastic discussion about this really fantastic book. And I'm very excited to be in conversation with Fida today to talk about her book, Stranger in My Own Land. I would give you a biography of Fida, but I think actually better than a biography would be if you buy the book and you read it, because the book is an autobiography of sorts. And you'll learn so much about her, but not just about her family, and really about the Palestinian struggle for justice over these many years. I find that this is to be a very important book that touches on really so many parts of the Palestinian story, the Palestinian tragedy. At the same time, it's a book full of life, full of love and family. It's a book of forging a path for an individual. It's about working for the liberation of a people, of not succumbing to cynicism, but also not allowing one to compromise on one's own foundational principles. I think it's a wonderful book that participates in a growing tradition of Palestinian writing about the varieties of Palestinian experiences. I mean, writing about Palestine by Palestinians has always been a daring political and even existential act, a way of saying to the world that Palestinians exist, regardless of what you have been told. And today there is more acknowledgement of Palestinian existence, perhaps, but we also seem farther away than ever from a just resolution to the Nakba, the catastrophe of Palestinian dispossession by Israel. So books today may still need to assert Palestinian existence, but they can also do so, it seems to me, with more nuance, more complexity, and both unity and differentiation as the Palestinian experience itself becomes so much more complex almost 75 years after dispossession. And Fida's book, Stranger in My Own Land, is a stellar example, to my mind, of precisely this tendency. So it's my great honor to be here with you today, Fida.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. It's an honor to be with you. And I'm really thankful to you and to Mayri, to the Lighthouse Bookshop, and to, of course, to everyone who's here with us today. Thank you so much.
So we're going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes or so. This is the plan. And then we'll take some questions from the audience for the remaining time. So, make sure you are thinking about those questions, and we'll have an opportunity to hear from the audience later on. But before we do that, let me just begin with a very straightforward question for you, Fida, which is really the question that I think almost every author gets asked. And that is the question of, well, why did you write this book?
Thank you, Mustafa. I think I wrote this book because my experience and my family's is so, you could call it unique in the Palestinian context post-Oslo, because very few Palestinians after the Oslo Accords were allowed to come back into their towns or villages of origin inside Israel. That is, in the areas that were occupied in 1948. My father was a senior member of the PLO. He directed the Palestine Research Center of the PLO, and there was a particular stipulation in the Oslo Accords that allowed a select, very few number of people to return after the Oslo Accords to inside Israel, to their towns and villages of origin, and it was thus that we made our return. So for us, it was really something up until that point that we had never dreamt of. My parents were in exile in Lebanon. There was no possibility due to my father's work that we would return. And we had this dream all our life of Palestine. And then it literally was almost like a fluke that we managed to do this and to come back. To me, it's also a little unique in the sense that I'm a Palestinian who has lived in the diaspora, of course, and then inside Israel, in my village in the Galilee, and also in the West Bank. I've been in Ramallah for about 13 years now. So my experience spans the Palestinian experience of living in these three places. And with the richness and all the nuance of it, and the time it took me also to come to terms with all these different facets of our life and the different dimensions of this experience. And it was this that made the desire in me to really write this book, to share all this.
The structure of the book also is itself, I think, quite fascinating, because it's really as much of a kind of family memoir as it is a national narrative, as you were just describing, that you have all the different constituent parts of the national narrative. But there's so much about family in it at the same time. And I'm curious, why did you choose to write the book this way? Is there a kind of specific Palestinian relationship between family and nation?
Yes, I think in the Palestinian context, Mustafa, I think it probably would not be an exaggeration to say that almost every Palestinian family has a connection to the nation and to the Palestinian struggle in some way, whether it's direct or even a little bit removed, in the sense that they're now in exile, or in Europe, in the States, in the Arab countries, and so on. But almost every Palestinian family will have had a mark due to the Nakba or the Naksa or the event, the things that have taken place historically in the last 20 years or so. For me, it was because my entire family experience and my life story was really defined by the fact that I belong to the Palestinian nation. So my life took the turns that it did, and I ended up in the places I was in, and my parents' life trajectory took the place it did because of their work in the Palestinian national struggle. For me, the two things are very much interwoven. One seems to reflect on the other constantly. There's a constant interplay between the two. And also, I wanted both to write the story of my family and to write the story of Palestine through it. In a sense, to give the reader a more immediate understanding of the effects of this conflict, of this trauma and tragedy on the lives of ordinary people and ordinary families. So this is what I'm hoping the book will achieve.
And yet at the same time, and I think the book totally does that, but yet at the same time, it is a kind of extraordinary book, because your father, for one thing, seems like an extraordinary man. For those who haven't had the privilege of reading this book yet, what can you tell us about Sabri? your father. I mean, he was remarkable. He brave, principled, and activist with Al-Ard, a lawyer who wrote a foundational text to the Arabs in Israel at an early stage of Palestinian scholarship on Palestine, a member of the resistance, a friend of Mahmoud Darwish, a confidant of Yasser Arafat, a returnee after Oslo, all of these many facets of Sabri. What do you want people to take away about him from reading this book?
Thank you so much, Mustafa. I think you've done a fantastic job of narrating all of these facets. My father, yes, is very much all of these and more. In writing this book, I was hugely affected by him. He is not only one of the key characters in the book, he also played a pivotal, extremely important role in putting this book together. Together with my uncle, his younger brother, who also features in the book. My father, as I state in the book, he was 10 years old when he saw the Nakba, and he witnessed it with his own eyes, in the sense that he saw people from a neighboring village being expelled across the border to Lebanon. As a child of 10 years old, that he told me, this image stayed in his head, and this was the beginning of something in him. Obviously, as a child, he didn't really understand. But this image and the developments after that of, the founding of the State of Israel and living under military rule and the harsh and discriminatory measures against the Palestinians who remained, all of this put him on his path. And the one thing I can say, in addition, Mustafa, to all the things you mentioned, is that I very much feel he has always had a passion for Palestine and for the Palestinian cause, and this passion has really dictated everything he has done in his life. So he has that one overriding mission of writing about Palestine, of speaking Palestine, of researching, of talking, of trying to affect at the time the political developments and so on. And this has driven all of his career and all of his life.
And yeah, thank you for the answer. I'm curious, I think we don't maybe hear as much about the women in your family from reading the book.
Yes.
And I would like to hear more about the women in your family and understand their relationship, not just to your family dynamic, but also to the struggles itself. From Hannah to Najwa and your Aunt Mona and all of the different women who are there. Like, what can you tell us about, the women in your family as well?
The women, I will start with my late mother, Hanni. She worked with my father at the Palestine Research Center in Beirut. And like most Palestinian women, she did an amazing job in my feeling and in my memory of looking after her family, while at the same time, like my father, being part of the national struggle, playing the role she played in research and in translations of Hebrew news in the center and so on, and in research of Israeli affairs. The women, if I can zoom out a little bit in the Palestinian context, I always feel that Palestinian women carry so many different, they play so many different roles. They are part of the national struggle. They're taking care of their families. They're being a network of support for their families and for each other and for their husbands, obviously. And they are also at the forefront of a lot of the activism, a lot of the national work. They are, I don't want to say silent heroes, because yes, many of them, are acknowledged and so on, but there's so much work that goes on within the family dynamics also to keep all this together. My mother lost her life in the explosion planted by Israel's allies against the research center in 1983. This was a loss that I never really, came to terms with, or it has marked my life since. After that, my father married my younger aunt, my mother's sister, Najwa. Najwa came in with so much love and so much care and tried to so much to make up for our mother's loss. So in that sense, she was also pivotal in our life. My aunts back home in the village, I interviewed all of them for the book. It was incredible how much of the brunt they bore as well. Like in any nationalist struggle, when a certain individual, in this case, for example, my father and my uncle, takes a decision to engage in nationalist work, or they are driven to it, ultimately it's almost never only themselves who, between brackets, pay the price. It's also their families. The crackdown happens on all the family. Israel had a systematic method of cracking down on the families of anybody who engaged in existence. Aunts were the pillars of the house, my grandfather's house, who kept it together during the police raids, the very harsh questioning, the constant harassment and hassle, even in their own village by their own people, some of whom were afraid or had been co-opted, and so on. And so really, I very much feel in all of these women, there's a silent but very formidable strength that just shines through all of this that they've had to live through and endure. And I'm actually very proud of all of them. And the memory of my mother, and also of my late stepmother, who sadly passed away in 2010, their memory is always a shining light for me in my own life, Mustafa.
I'm here speaking with Fida about her book, Stranger in My Own Land, and please prepare your questions for her, because we will have time for questions and answers at the end. I'm also curious about, how the book was made, how you constructed it, because it seems like on one level it's a family story, that those are things that wouldn't require necessarily book research, but at the same time, it feels like there's also a lot of research that actually went into the book, both on the national level and on the family level. You just said you interviewed all of your aunts for the book too. So, could you tell us how you went about, sort of creating the book itself? And along with that question, I also am curious if, there were things that you discovered along the way that surprised you, that you didn't know, and that were revealing for you.
The creation of the book, Mustafa, yes, was very much a joint effort in terms of both interviewing family members and also of research. An incredible amount of research went into the book, because essentially I covered the period from the Nakba, and even slightly before. I wrote about how Zionism came about, and how, the events that took place under the British mandate, and that eventually led to the establishment of the State of Israel. So really, I started from, you could say, the turn of the last century. And it ended very recently. It ended today. In fact, I think the last big event I describe in the book is the killing of the Al Jazeera journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh. So that's, that's a century of time, more, slightly more than a century. And so initially, I started out, thinking, okay, I'm going to write the family story, and then I will start filling in the pieces. Inevitably, as I went along, it all kind of merged together. I began to do the family interviews, and then to do the transcripts. From then, I started to weave the story, and then the political events that were being referred to, I then had to go and do the background research in order to put what I was hearing in the context of those events. But that wasn't all. After that, there was a process of coming back to double check with my father, with my uncle, about the information I had researched and how it fit in. Another challenge was that obviously I'm asking questions about things that happened 50 or even 60 years ago, even in their personal context. So there was, I had several times to go back and forth, corroborate information, make sure that, we were accurate, they were accurate in their account. And honestly, this book, for me, it was a journey, really a journey, as I write in the prologue to the book. It was a journey into my own family history, which I would never have discovered to this level of detail had I not written this book. It was really incredible how much information I didn't know, and I found out only because, I really went into in-depth interviews with the aim of creating this work. At the same time, I learned a lot about the history of Palestine that I also didn't know, because I went into a lot more detail than the main events that we all know as Palestinians. So really, for me, it was really an incredible educational experience, as well as a documentary or narrative one, in that sense.
Is there any specific detail that you can remember that seemed like surprising to you while you were, writing the book, that you hadn't known before? I'm just curious.
Oh, there were many. There were so many. One of them that stands out is when my father abruptly shared with me in one of our interviews with him that he had been kidnapped in Beirut for a while. This was before the the Sabra and Shatila and all that. He had been kidnapped by the Christian phalangists for several hours, and that he was able to be released. I had no idea, for example, about that detail. The way that my uncle, after he was taking part in a resistance operation, and they met a roadblock on the way as they were trying to transport some arms to the West Bank, and he was shot in the leg, and he escaped across the border into Lebanon. Finding out about that story, and as my uncle told it to me in the detail, was incredible, because all my life I'd grown up and my uncle was around, and I love him very much. He's he's almost like a second father. He has a lot of standing because he was with us in Beirut as well. And about my dad and about my uncle, there was so much information that I didn't even have an inkling of. So really, it was very heartwarming in a way, because it felt like I was also getting to know them almost all over again, in that sense.
Yeah, beautiful. How long did it take you to put this all together?
Oh, the big question. Okay, the listeners will be shocked to hear that the initial idea for this book took place 12 years ago. 12 years ago. And then I began more slowly. I began to kind of, do a little bit of research here and there. Obviously, in the 12 years, I was doing a lot of other things. I was working. I produced 3 Arabic collections of short stories. I took part in an English book by Breaking the Silence, Kingdom of Olives and Ash. And so there was a lot going on, but I wrote a first draft, and I gave it to my dad in 2015, thinking that I was done. And then the answer he gave me was, no, that this is not it. And between the lines, I understood that basically I hadn't even started. So essentially, the really hard work began then. 2015-16 began, an immense period of research. And it continued. The last 3 years, particularly during the COVID period, was when I really focused and really did so much more research, and went back also to the characters that I had interviewed for more clarification. And those are the 3 years that I really felt I was putting this together. But it took an incredible amount of time, Mustafa, and effort, and edits and re-editing and rethinking, because obviously another thing I faced with the time span I was covering, the book was far too long. It was just, it turned into a, so I had to make painful decisions to cut out many parts of it, cut out stories about Mahmoud Darwish, Samih al-Qasim, for example, Muhammad Mari, people who were with my father. Cut out some of the also funny, you can say, or lighter family stories as well. Cut out some of the historical context in certain places, or really abbreviated. So this is always a painful decision for any writer after you've worked on something, to deliberately cut it. But you also know that you cannot give the reader, 200,000 words. I mean, certainly not for a first book. So there were those difficult decisions being made there.
Well, one of the, within that, some of the things that remain, I thought was interesting too. Like, for example, in the book, there's obvious political repression against Palestinians, such as your father and many people that we find inside of Israel. But even at the same time, there were allies among the Israeli population early on. Among the Jewish population, people like Uri Avner or Mordecai Stein, and even some lesser known figures such as, you talk about a Dr. Theodore Wurtzel in the book, and your father's education. Does this tell us something about the situation in Haifa in the 1960s? How is the situation different today between sort of, say, allies within the Jewish population in Israel back then, and if they are still around today? Or, can you talk about that context?
Yes, Mustafa. I mean, at the time, obviously my father shared this information with me about, the different characters that you mentioned, different individuals who were very much in support of the Palestinians and understood that a grave injustice had been done. Dr. Theodore Herzl that my father spoke about, he actually did his lawyer training with him. And the man had tragically lost his wife to the Holocaust. On coming to Israel, he understood the plight of the Palestinians. And when he was subjected to pressure by the Secret Service to fire my father, to not let him continue with him, he shocked them, he shocked the interrogators or whatever by telling them, this is similar to the practices that we have just run away from in Germany. And so these are very principled people that understood what was going on at the time. From my understanding, these people have existed. Obviously, these individuals have been there since Israel's creation. There have always been people of conscience who have understood the terrible injustice that was inflicted on the Palestinians. These Israelis were always in a conundrum, in a difficult situation, if one looks at it, because on the one hand, this is their country, we can say, or the nation they belong to. On the other hand, they are aware of the background of what's going on and so forth. From speaking to several of them, and I only say this from conversations with people, I'm not really an expert on, the true numbers today, but as far as I understand, there was a much bigger movement, for example, Peace Now and so on, perhaps 20 or 30 years ago. And today, unfortunately, the rise of the right in Israel has shrunk this segment of people, although they are still very much there. Of course, I speak very generally. My father also shared some of this information with me, as did some other Israeli friends. But today it's a difficult, very difficult context we are living in. The number of these voices is dwindling, and the right is really in power to the full. For me personally, Mustafa, it was very, very, and I always say this whenever I've addressed an Israeli audience or when I speak to Israeli friends who I've made in the last few years, it really took me almost 20 years of living in this country to begin to see and to understand, and only really when I started on the Breaking the Silence project, to begin to understand that there are those, Israeli individuals and even organizations that are working for the rights of Palestinians and that understand. And that has been very, very heartwarming and almost bittersweet, if I can use that word. You're very gratified to find people who are speaking the voice of conscience, and they've become good friends and a little bit of a relief, when one looks at this dark reality that we're living at the moment.
Indeed, and I think we're seeing even the rise of dangerous right-wing movements actually across the globe today, all over. Speaking personally, as a my family roots come from Egypt, but Palestine has always had a very close place in my heart. But as has Lebanon, actually, and I go frequently back and forth to Lebanon. And you were born in Lebanon, and you write about happy times in Lebanon, and you write about dark times in Lebanon, about the Civil War, the massacre at Sabri and Shatila, the terrible tragedy of the death of your mother that you were talking about earlier. What place does Lebanon have in your story, in your heart, or even in the Palestinian story?
In my own story, or in my own heart, Mustafa, it holds a painful place. I mean, Lebanon was the place I experienced, as I said, the largest and most painful loss of my life. As an Israeli citizen now, I'm not allowed to go to Lebanon. But I mean, even if I were, I think I would hesitate to visit, simply because there's just a very big trauma there. At the same time, I mean, I'm in touch with some of our friends who were with us in Cyprus, and they went back there, some of my father's friends from when we lived in Cyprus. So I do follow the developments in the country, and it saddens me. The country has been in a very difficult situation in the last few years, economically, politically, and so on. But for me, it's that place where I think of with pain, because my last memories there, the last few years, were really traumatic. In the general Palestinian context, Lebanon holds a very important place in the Palestinian experience because, first of all, the Palestinian refugee camps there, it was a first stop for most or many of the Palestinians fleeing from the Galilee, from the north of Palestine, on foot, of course, and they were settled in Lebanon. So in that sense, there is a huge connection between Lebanon and Palestine. But also the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon have always endured very difficult conditions. They were never really nationalized. They were never given Lebanese citizenship. They are barred from, until today, from practicing many professions, and they really went through a lot of horrors there. So again, I mean, the country, I think, is problematic and painful in the Palestinian context. And it's also somewhere that we feel, despite all this, is very near. It's very near. I mean, in my village in Fassouta, Lebanon is barely just a few kilometers away. So I've always had this very strange notion of being always so close to that place. And yet for the last, ever since we left in 1983, obviously, I've never been able to go back.
Yeah, speaking of, movement from one place to another, the story really becomes one of wandering after Lebanon. You've already mentioned Cyprus, but you go from Cyprus back to Israel and Fassouta and Haifa. You go to Glasgow, Canada, Ramallah, ultimately back to Fassouta, back to Ramallah. I mean, you write, powerfully about being an outsider in so many of these places. Do you feel like Cyprus or Glasgow or Canada or Ramallah are home, or were ever home to you? Or what is home to you?
This is one of the most difficult questions that I've always grappled with myself. And it's a question that my best friends know, because, I've often discussed this with my closest friends. Perhaps I can quote my father on this. He once shocked me as well during the process of the book by telling me he doesn't really feel he has a home anywhere per se. He says, I'm physically in Fassouta, but mentally I'm everywhere else. I'm following the Palestinian experience wherever it is. In my sense, I think just having the sheer movement that has taken place in my life and the voluntary and involuntary uprooting from one place to another has really made it difficult for me to look at any place and call it home. I still feel a little bit of a stranger in Ramallah. I'm not from Ramallah, although I feel a lot of love and warmth from my friends and from society here, and I have, a lot of social connections and so on. Again, I'm a stranger in Fassouta, although my parents are from Fassouta and I'm from there and everything, but I'm a stranger in the place. I didn't grow up there. I came into the culture as an adult. So again, I didn't live there for many years. Glasgow and Canada, the UK and Canada played a very big role in my life, in my link to the Western world. But they were smaller stations. I feel the bigger place was Cyprus, because that's where I spent my years of adolescence, and right through the years when I went through to university, I was going back and forth to the UK. Cyprus until today holds a very dear place in my heart, and I try to visit as much as I can. Perhaps that's the place that I still feel has the biggest remnant of home. And I think, Mustafa, in recent years, I've come to terms with something that my brother told me once. He said, perhaps you will never settle down anywhere, and perhaps you will be more at peace with yourself if you recognize that. And in a sense, I've in thinking about this over the years and in realizing that I'm representative in many ways of the Palestinian experience, I think what happens is a lot of Palestinians who have, had as much movement as I have, start their lives, become a collection of these fragments, and that ultimately defines the person that they are. And it's true that perhaps I don't feel a sense of security, and yet I feel that my life has been so enriched by all these different experiences, by the fact that I've, met so many cultures, so many people. Even in writing this book, I was even sometimes able to reflect on my own experience and our own experience from the eyes of the rest of the world, because I've traveled around so much and I've lived in other places. So, I mean, I hope that wasn't too too long of an answer to the question, but there is no answer really.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you know, my mentor, I worked with Edward Said at Columbia for graduate school, and Edward Said used to say something very similar. You know, it's like there's definitely a yearning for a home. There's definitely a yearning for a place and for justice to be found in the Palestinian reconstitution of a Palestinian nation. But at the same time, you know, being an exile, being a wanderer around the world was a great strength for him at the same time too. You know, it was a way of understanding also the ways in which nationalism can be a destructive force in a way too. And so I think that there's that conundrum of home and nation is one that I think many people should think about more fully.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Yes.
Moving from there, though, to something more specific, because another element of the book that I think is very important, especially for readers coming, I think, from the Western world or places that are a little more far afield from the place in Palestine itself, is the book describes, I think, in a lot of great detail, you know, what the situation is like for Palestinian citizens of Israel. I think that can be quite unknown for people outside the region. You write, for example, about how more than half of the Palestinians in Israel live below the poverty line, or being in Israel was always a reminder of the dispossession of Palestine being in front of you. You would see destroyed villages. You encountered a sign that says "No dogs, no Arabs" at one point. You have these national parks that are also remnants built over the remnants of these destroyed cities and all of that. You know, what was that was that also a desire for you when writing the book? Was it a way of trying to illuminate the situation of life for Palestinians in Israel?
Absolutely, Mustafa. Yes, particularly as sadly, I felt that much of the world, particularly I think since the Oslo Accords and even before, I mean, since the Intifadas, much of the world has been focused on the plight of the Palestinians in the occupied territories in the West Bank and in Gaza. Rightfully so in some sense, because you know, the Intifadas were raging here, and there was you know, Israel in 1967 almost moved the apparatus of, let's say, outright oppression, military rule and so on, moved it from the 1948 areas to here, to the West Bank and to Gaza. So, but at the same time, I mean, the Palestinians, what we call the 1948 Palestinians who remained in Israel after its creation, really they were a silent minority that was left completely to fend and struggle for itself. In fact, in the very early years, my father was telling me that, you know, obviously there was a complete cutoff from the Arab world, so they lost their natural links and connections to the Arab world. And he said sometimes news would leak through that we are being accused of being Israelized or Judaized, that we have lost our national struggle and so on. And you know, it was sad because all the people that were working so hard to against the military rule at the time in Israel and against the apparatus that the Palestinians found themselves against, there was very, very little, if anything, known about them outside. This situation persisted for decades. The Arab world remained ignorant almost by choice of the Palestinians living in Israel. And very, very recently, in recent years, I feel there's been more of an understanding, let's say, of the fact that we are not, I don't know which word to use, traitors in that sense, that we are simply people who remained on our land, on our ancestral land, and that we had no choice, obviously, in the founding of the state of Israel, and that we found ourselves this, you know, oppressed, discriminated against minority, whose literally the carpet had been pulled out from under their feet, whose so many of their neighbors and friends had either been exiled or killed. Entire villages were wiped out. There were also the internally displaced Palestinians in Israel. Not everyone whose villages were destroyed was necessarily thrown outside the country. Some of them remained. And this is something that I speak about in the book about Sahmata, which is a village near us. And I've always wondered, which is worse, to be just far away and removed, or to be scattered around in the Galilee and to drive by the site of their village and just see the remains of it. So really, I've always had this desire to expose the plight of this segment of the Palestinian population, which really has played also a historic role in the perseverance even of the Palestinian people on their own land. And I really wanted to also say that we are here, that we are part of the Palestinian people, and that since Oslo also, there's been a forced severing between the Palestinians inside Israel and those in the West Bank. So it's a very complicated reality, and I hope I did my best in the book to try and explain to the reader the fact that we live in all parts of the country and not just in the occupied Palestinian territories today.
And in fact, yeah, I think the book is coming at this very important moment right now too, because there is more recognition of this reality that you're describing, even among Palestinians right now, today, right there. I think there's more unity among Palestinians across the divides than we've seen at any time in the past. And there's a big discussion around the ways in which human rights are denied in the occupied territories and in the 48 areas, and connecting that the struggles and seeing that those struggles are common and not distinct. The rhetoric itself is changing, the struggle itself is changing. And I think, so your book is really coming at this very important moment in the sort of Palestine national movement that we've seen historically. What accounts for this change, do you think?
Sometimes, Mustafa, I feel that it's just the passage of time itself doing its work. The fact that after the Nakba, people were shell-shocked. I mean, really, it took several decades, if you like, for the Palestinians to really begin to organize themselves politically properly in the real sense. I mean, there was obviously resistance work from the outset, but it was so, I mean, the blow of what happened was so severe that it really took the Palestinians at least, I believe, at least, 10, 20 years from that point to really begin to organize. And past that point, they had to work in a very complex web of Arab dictatorships as such, which made the Palestinian struggle extremely difficult, because there they were, refugees in all these Arab countries. They wanted to engage in armed struggle because they had the hope of liberating Palestine, of regaining their homeland, of going back home to their destroyed villages, to their properties that had been, overnight, taken from them overnight. But the Arab countries are obviously that are geographically adjacent to Israel had no desire for confrontation with Israel, despite all the lip service, if you like, or their public statements about support for Palestine. Most of them actually, I mean, now we can say this, most of them used Palestine simply as a bargaining chip. None of them were really serious about it. And so then, and the proof of that, or that was manifested, as we saw in Black September in Jordan, and the terrible massacres that took place against the Palestinians there. A decade later, Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon. So again, terrible massacres and so on. They were unwanted everywhere they went. I think it was just the natural passage of time and the fact that the Palestinians persevered. And I also believe, and this is my own feeling or my own take on it, if you like, that recently, I think the interconnectivity of the world, especially in terms of the media and social media, and the fact that today we have access to one another like never before. I believe that I've certainly seen even in my own personal experience, since we had the things like Facebook, things like social media and email and interacting and so on, and we are able to form more connections with each other across the different geographical divides. I believe that was the start really of this coming together in that sense. Also, the fact that there are now new generations that are a lot more technologically savvy and even aware of the world around them. They connect with each other a lot more. They're more with the times, shall we say, and they are also more open to the experiences in other parts of the world, the revolutions that have taken place and so on. In recent years, I've seen some, even since I moved to Ramallah, there's a lot of cultural work being done back and forth between the West Bank and between Palestinians and Israel, for example. And that's very heartwarming and really, really lovely to witness, that we are, becoming closer to one another despite this terrible wall of separation that exists between us. So. And
perhaps also more interested in organizing without the charisma of a leader. So there's more leaderless organizing around an issue, which I think you can see around the world in other political struggles, and I see that as a potential positive measure as well. I don't want to monopolize our conversation. We have several questions that have already come in, so let me start with some of these questions. We actually have a question coming from your brother. So,
from Musa, yes.
Yes. He says, I have a dual question for both. Is nationalism worth it? What is the way forward for Palestinian anti-nationalists? Oh, the brothers always ask the hardest questions.
Yes, he's actually touching on something you spoke about earlier, Mustafa, with Edward Said. This is something I've also battled with between, with me and myself as such. I think perhaps here it might be worthwhile to make the difference, to state the difference in a way between nationalism per se and between a people's fight and struggle for their denied rights. I think there's a nuanced difference in there. The fact that you have a people who are living under a terrible, terrible system of oppression, really. And all they are asking is their right to live in freedom and in dignity like any normal human being. In that sense, I'm not really so much into the hardcore nationalism, if you like, as I am into the people's right to live in freedom and dignity. And I think in the Palestinian context, there have been some voices in recent years that have said that, for example, when we bring in the discussion of the one-state solution, sometimes, two-state versus one-state and so on, nationalism really becomes very blurry at that point. Because, you start talking about, a country that lives, a country for all its citizens, a country that lives, that grants everybody equality and equity and so forth. So in that sense, I do agree with Musa in the sense that really it should not be the exclusive focus anymore, but rather our continued fight, which is, as difficult as ever, to remove this yoke of both, military occupation here in the Palestinian territories and the blanket apartheid that's covering all of us, whether we are here or inside Israel, to remove it from us, from our heads, from our lives, to just be able to live like normal human beings.
Yes, thank you. I couldn't agree more. We have a question from Karim, who says, thank you for sharing how the interviews surfaced these stories. We should all speak to our elders more often. Was there anything, though, you worried about revealing to the wider world or considered not including?
Yes, of course. And I think every writer will probably attest to this. When you are writing an autobiography or a biography of your family, of your close ones, there will always be certain things that you cannot share or you do not want to share. And I think this is only normal because there are certain things that perhaps will touch on some particularly painful things within your family, and also that may not really serve the purpose for which you are sharing. In other words, in my own account of myself, for example, there were certain facets of my life that I didn't really go into. I mean, my field of education, I only touched on it, that I changed afterwards. My, certain personal things that it was really a question of selecting the detail, first of all, that you're going to include. And also, and sometimes you don't share certain details because you want to protect your loved ones as well. For example, I'll give an example. There were certain details of my father and my uncle's resistance work back in the day that even today they were not really very comfortable sharing. Most of it is in there, but there were certain things that they preferred not to share, because until this point in time we are still living in this state, and we still have this apparatus to deal with. So it's little things like this. But I think, I have yet to meet any writer that is able to tell you, yes, I wrote an autobiography and I was just able to write everything. It's not easy.
Yes, absolutely. We have a question from Eli. He writes, I have just received your book from Lighthouse and begun, and was struck by the beautiful language, I agree, but also how you map the history of nation and family, which feels accessible to anyone who doesn't know much about Palestine's plight. Who did you hope your reader would be? Who do you wish to read it?
Firstly, thank you very much, Eli. I'm really honored and gratified by what you said. Thank you. My vision, Mustafa, when I began on this book, and that was the reason I chose to write it in English, my vision was the average Western reader, and exactly the one that Eli just mentioned, someone who doesn't know much, about the situation here. I hope to give enough detail to tell our story, and at the same time not to make it a deeply historical or political book that would just turn people off. I didn't want it to be a research book in that sense, although large parts of it ended up as research. But I wanted to basically answer the question, and the question that I've heard many times in my own life when I was in the UK, in Canada, and even in Cyprus from my friends there. We know there's a problem between the Palestinians and Israel. We really know nothing about it, or we don't understand. This is what I hope the book would do in that sense. A one book account that would give the reader an understanding of this conflict, at least in its basic terms, and serve, hopefully, to generate enough interest for the reader to then go on and read more from other sources and other writers if they wish to pursue it further.
Yeah, I think the book actually succeeds brilliantly in that, and you have it's heavily footnoted, not to scare people off, but just to say that there are arrows that you can follow if you want to get more information that are found within the book. And as an illustration,
thankfully Hurst put the footnotes at the end, because I think it's better for the readers to just kind of not see those on every page.
I completely agree. And just as an illustration about the sort of peripatetic and diasporic life that you've led, the next one that we have coming from our audience is it says, not a question, but warm greetings from Diana in Haifa, Sarah in Virginia, Khalil Hamid from New York, and love from Sibyl in Switzerland, among many.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's awesome. Yes, there's so many people tuning in from so many places in the world. I am so heartwarmed and so grateful, honestly, for all this. Thank you with all my heart to everybody.
I think that is, that's an illustration, not just of your life, but really of the possibilities of a global community, just that we should all live precisely, we all live on this earth. We all have to learn how to live with one another. Okay, we have another question coming from Tom. He says, myself and my family all look forward to reading the new book, as we have heard so much of your other literature. Are you planning on or working on any other works in the English language?
Yes, I am, although it's not my own work. I am actually in process of translating my father's book, A History of Zionism, in two parts, which he wrote in the 1970s and 1980s. There were two parts published. He wrote a detailed, meticulously researched account of Zionism from its early beginnings, and pretty much until the eve of the founding of the State of Israel. So he tackles that historical era. It's a big book. It's 2 volumes, and I read the book as part of my research for my own book, and then I immediately felt that I wanted to translate this into English to make it available to a Western reader as well. I've been working on that for about a year now, and I estimate I will have probably still at least another year to go, because It's not just translating, but it's also making sure that you find all the terms correctly in English, the names of people and organizations and events and so on. And I think that will probably take me through this coming year. And beyond that, no immediate plans. I think, you know, this book has been daunting up until this point. So we'll see what the future brings. Thank you, Tom.
And from Jared, another question. The questions are coming in now. So we have from Jared: to write of Palestine is inherently political these days, at least, he says. What advice do you have for other Palestinians who seek to share their stories or Palestinian history for a Western audience? What are the greatest challenges to navigate?
Yes, this is a very good question. The first challenge I really felt, and Gerard will know this because I did share with he and Salwa, who are very good friends, about the challenges I had finding a publisher for the book, Mustafa. It is not easy. Although so much is now known about Palestine, although we have made leaps and bounds from where we were 20, 30, 40 years ago, it is still difficult to find a home for a Palestinian narrative. I was turned away, I will share this honestly, I was turned away from many, many places. Sometimes it was done rather harshly, I felt. Some of it, of course, was the opinion of certain publishers, and I respect that. Not everybody will look at the work and, you know, and appraise it the same way. But I did receive several responses that, you know, along the lines of, you know, Palestine is no longer interesting. So there was a sort of belittling of it, or, you know, this is repeating things that have already been said, or, you know, the readers now are looking for something different. I mean, different ways of really breaking your wings, so to speak. The first and foremost advice I would have for anybody is persevere and stick with it. The publisher Hearst, who kindly published this book, really came at the point when I had almost given up, Mustafa, and I shared with a friend. I said, I'm so tired. If by the beginning of the year I have not secured a publisher at the beginning of this year, I was actually thinking to self-publish the book because I was so tired of this long road that I had taken, and that was, you know, not showing any results. Persevere. The break will come. You will find a publisher who will look at the work and take it on and be convinced of it. And the other advice I suppose I would give is, I heard this from several people who have read my writing, and they said it's good in the sense that it's not sloganistic. And I wasn't trying to, I was removed a little bit from the slogans or from the stereotyping and so on, and I was very much focused on telling the story and recounting the events. And that's something that, you know, in the reader's eye will always give you credibility, that you're not just, I mean, there's a lot of emotion in the book, the reader will sense it. But I am recounting the events as they are and leaving the reader to experience those emotions for him or herself as such. So I think those two things are paramount in my mind when I was working on this book.
Yeah, I think that's terrific advice. We have probably our final question from the audience, from Amin, who says, hi, Fida, do you feel the same level of isolation in the diaspora in the West as you did in Haifa?
Interesting. No, actually, Haifa was worse. Haifa was worse. It's, yeah, rather than the other way, because I'll tell you why. Because when I lived in the West, I mean, in the West, I'm a foreigner at the end of the day. You know, you're from a certain country and you immigrate and you live in another. You're a foreigner in that country, and therefore you're expected, or, you know, it's normal to feel that, you know, this is not really your place, and, you know, you acclimatize with time, you integrate. Different people do so to varying degrees. You know, people obviously set up new homes and lives in other countries and so on. Having that feeling when you're in your own country is the worst, because, you know, there's no script for that. Like, this is supposed to be your own country, and yet stranger in my own land. And that's a really jarring and unsettling feeling, because if you feel like this in your country, where are you supposed to go in that sense? So you will really be a foreigner everywhere, because you're a foreigner in some sense. You're a foreigner even in your ancestral place where your parents come from, which technically is supposed to be the place that you feel at home. So this is the most pained part of our existence as Palestinians in Israel. And it was another of the driving factors even that caused me to write this book in the first place, my constant struggle for belonging and for feeling my dignity and my acceptance in my own land.
We have, I think, just the final comment from Diana. And thank you for that answer, because I think that was really a very powerful answer. And that is, your father's book was formative for me. It was one of the few English language books written by a Palestinian at the time, and it was excellent. So Diana writes that she's very excited about this and your future work. And I just want to say not only thank you for your father's books and your father's work, but really thank you for your book and thank you for your work, because this book, I think, has the potential and the beauty to really bring about a depth of understanding to this issue, and a range of understanding to the issue that we often don't see. So I'm excited to be a part of it, and I want to just thank you again for writing it.
Thank you very, very much, Mustafa. Thank you, Diana. Thank you to everyone who is with me tonight. I'm truly delighted and honored with you all. And I really hope very much that you will like the book and look forward to hearing from you about it. Mustafa,